Hi friends, welcome to the next video of our B101 sequence. We are going to be looking into Article 4, Supplemental and Additional Services. And as you can see, it's not a terribly long article, and this first page sort of dominates with this table, and like there's another piece of it there, and we had already referenced this table, and now we're going to look a little more in depth in it. Essentially, this table is a list of supplemental services that in theory an architect could get paid extra for. So there we go. 4.1 Supplemental Services. 4.1.1. The services listed below are not included in basic services, but may be required for the project. The architect shall provide the listed supplemental services only if specifically designated in the table below as the architect's responsibility, and the owner shall compensate the architect as provided in section 11.2. Unless otherwise specifically addressed in this agreement, if neither the owner nor the architect is designated, the parties agree that the listed supplementary service is not being provided for the project. Designate the architect's supplemental services and the owner's supplemental services required for the project by indicating whether the architect or owner shall be responsible for providing the identified supplemental service. Insert a description of the supplemental services in section 4.1.2 below, or attach the description of services as an exhibit to this agreement. So this is where you say who's responsible for what. If you don't say anything, that means that you don't need any of these supplemental services. So what do we have here? We have programming. And then I guess before we dive into the list, you can see that the table is divided into supplemental services and then who's responsible for them. So this does not mean that you have to fill out all these fields here. It just means that if one of these apply, then you have to say who's providing it. Okay, so we have, and essentially you don't need to memorize all these services, but just to get a really good sense of what is basic service and what is supplemental service. And earlier when we were looking into Article 3, it was specifically spelled out what you need to have for SD, for DD, and for CDs. So we have here programming multiple preliminary designs. We talked about this. Measure drawings. This, I guess, would apply if you have an existing structure and you have to send somebody to in the field and provide measured drawings. Existing facility surveys. I guess that covers it as well. Site evaluation and planning. Building information model management responsibilities. Development of building information models for post-construction use. Civil engineering, and we talked about this, how, and like we saw that owner can have a separate contract with a civil engineer, but if that's not the case, then civil engineer will be employed by the architect, and then the civil engineer will be like a separate consultant. Landscape design, architectural interior design. That's interesting, and like, because you would almost take this for granted that interior design is part of your basic service, but there you go, it sounds like it's not. Value analysis, detailed cost estimating beyond that required in section 6.3, on-site project representation, conform documents for construction, as designed record drawings, as constructed record drawings, post-occupancy evaluation, facility support services, tenant-related services, architect's coordination of the owner's consultants. So yeah, that's also a big one to remember, that it's a supplemental service. Telecommunications / data design, security evaluation and planning, commissioning. And if you don't know what commissioning is, that's okay. It will certainly appear in your studying, probably more in C, but essentially commissioning is a process in which you have an agent, like somebody who comes in after the final completion and inspects all the systems in the building to make sure that everything operates as it was specified. Sustainable project services pursuant to section 4.1.3. So this means that sustainable objective is, in a sense, supplemental service. Fast track design services, multiple bid packages, historic preservation, furniture, furnishings, and equipment design, other services provided by specialty consultants, and other supplemental services that you think of, or just generally that the project requires. Description 4.1.2, description of supplemental services. A description of each supplemental service identified in section 4.1.1 as the architect's responsibility is provided below. So this is where you explain it. Describe in detail the architect's supplemental service identified in section 4.1.1, or if set forth in an exhibit, identify the exhibit. The AIA publishes a number of standard form of architect services documents that can be included as an exhibit to describe the architect's supplemental services. 4.1.2.2, a description of each supplemental service identified in section 4.1.1 as the owner's responsibility is provided below. Describe in detail the owner's supplemental services identified in 4.1.1, or as if set forth in an exhibit, identify the exhibit. 4.1.3, if the owner identified a sustainable objective in Article 1, the architect shall provide, as a supplemental service, the sustainability services required in the AIA document E204, Sustainable Projects Exhibit, attached to this agreement. The owner shall compensate the architect as provided in section 11.2. Okay. Yeah, we mentioned, like, if you're pursuing a sustainable objective, that's a supplemental service. Well, that's kind of sad, but hopefully it changes. Okay, 4.2. Architect's additional services. So you might be wondering, okay, what's the difference between supplemental and additional? And this is one of the differences that happened between the 2007 version of this agreement to 2017. What is supplemental now, it used to be additional. But let's see what additional means right now. And also, before I dive into this, your ARE exam is going to be using 2017, the latest version. When I was studying for these AREs, it was just the transition period between 07 and 17, and we had to study the differences between the two. So this was one of them, but we are today sticking to 17. Okay, a little digression there. 4.2, architect's additional services. The architect may provide additional services after execution of this agreement without invalidating the agreement, except for services required due to the fault of the architect. Any additional services provided in accordance with this section 4.2 shall entitle the architect to compensation pursuant to section 11.3 and an appropriate adjustment in the architect's schedule. So essentially it means if after you sign this contract and like let's say at the time of signing the contract, the owner says, I don't need multiple bid packages. We don't need that. And then when the time comes to be bidding, the owner goes, well, we need multiple bid packages. Then you say, okay, I'm happy to do multiple bid packages, but that's an additional service right now, and you have to compensate me for that. Okay, 4.2.1. Upon recognizing the need to perform the following additional services, the architect shall notify the owner with reasonable promptness and explain the facts and circumstances giving rise to the need. So this is a little, what happened? The architect shall not proceed to provide the following additional services until the architect receives the owner's written authorization. Point 1. Services necessitated by a change in the initial information, previous instructions, or approvals given by the owner, or a material change in the project, including size, quality, complexity, the owner's schedule or budget for cost of the work, or procurement of delivery method. Okay, those are big changes. Point 2, services necessitated by the enactment of revision of codes, laws, or regulations, including changing or editing previously prepared instruments of service. Point 3, changing or editing previously prepared instruments of service necessitated by official interpretations or of applicable codes, laws, or regulations that are either A, contrary to specific interpretations by the applicable authorities having jurisdiction made prior to the issuance of the building permit, or B, contrary to requirements of the instruments of service when those instruments of service were prepared in accordance with the applicable standard of care. So yeah, these are pretty major situations in which architect shouldn't really do anything extra without the owner's approval. In fact, I really think as an architect, you should get the owner's approval before you venture into anything that could be extra. And you can see there's the rest of this list. Point 4, services necessitated by decisions of the owner not rendered in a timely manner or any other failure of performance on the part of the owner or the owner's consultants or contractors. Point 5, preparing digital models or other design documentation for transmission to the owner's consultants and contractors or to other owner authorized recipients. Point 6, preparation of design and documentation for alternate bid or proposal request proposed by the owner. We kind of talked about this. Preparation for and attendance at a public presentation, meeting, or hearing. Preparation for and attendance at a dispute resolution proceeding or legal proceeding except where the architect is party thereto. Evaluation of the qualifications of entities providing bids or proposals. Consultation concerning replacement of work resulting from fire or other cause during construction. Or 11, assistance to the initial decision maker if other than architect. So the way I read this is this paragraph sort of gives you a list of situations that have certainly happened in the past, and because they happened in the past, they are in the agreement right now. And all of these are pretty serious moments in which architect is asked to do something, but it should get paid to do those things. And do you need to know all these cases by heart? I don't think so, but you should understand, have a feeling. I mean, I know it's kind of like a fluffy word to use, but just kind of like having a feeling of what's basic service and what's supplemental and what's additional. It's really important. And then like illustrating all these situations to you, just kind of picturing them in your head is a good way of developing this understanding of what is basic service and what is extra. Okay. 4.2.2. To avoid delay in the construction phase, the architect shall provide the following additional services: notify the owner with reasonable promptness and explain the facts and circumstances giving rise to the need. If, upon receipt of the architect's notice, the owner determines that all parts of the services are not required, the owner shall give prompt written notice to the architect of the owner's determination. The owner shall compensate the architect for services provided prior to the architect's receipt of the owner's notice. So this is kind of like describing a little bit of a gray field. And this is, again, a paragraph that somebody could argue, oh, this is very biased towards architects, because essentially what happens here is that architect figured or realized, oh, I need to do some extra work on this, and it's so important that it happens right now. I need to act promptly. And right after I'm done with this, I'm going to notify the owner of this. And the owner receives it, and then the owner looks at it and says, well, I don't think you need to do these two things. These three other things are okay. But if the owner has already done all 5 things, this paragraph says that the architect needs to get paid for everything, even those things that the owner doesn't think are necessary. And we'll see what those things are. Reviewing a contractor's submittal out of sequence for the submittal schedule approved by the architect. Responding to the contractor's requests for information that are not prepared in accordance with the contract documents, or where such information is available to the contractor from careful study and comparison of the contract documents, field conditions, other owner-provided information, contractor prepared coordination drawings, or prior project correspondence or documentation. Point 3, preparing change orders and construction change directives that require evaluation of contractors' proposals and supporting data, or the preparation or revision of instruments of service. Point 4, evaluating an extensive number of claims as the initial decision maker. Or point 5, evaluating substitutions proposed by the owner or contractor and making subsequent revisions to instruments of service resulting therefrom. Yeah, so be really familiar with this and imagine these scenarios. 4.2.3. The architect shall provide construction phase services exceeding the limits set forth below as additional services. When the limits below are reached, the architect shall notify the owner. Point 1. BLA reviews of each shop drawing, product data item, sample, and similar submittals of the contractor. Point 2. BLA visits to the site by the architect during construction. BLA inspection. Point 3. BLA inspections for any portion of the work to determine whether such portion of the work is substantially complete in accordance with the requirements of the contract documents. Point 4, BLA inspections for any portion of the work to determine final completion. So you would put numbers in here. So, I mean, if we're looking at point one, this means that, let's say we put 2 reviews of each shop drawing, product data, item, sample, or similar submittals of the contractor. So this means that if you receive those cabinetry shop drawings and you have comments on them because they don't match the design intent or something is wrong, and you send them back to be reviewed and resubmitted, and then you receive them the second time and you see, well, they fixed a lot of things, but there's still some things that are not quite right. And then you say revise and resubmit. But then the third time when you get the submittal, that's an additional service. And you should then notify the owner of that. So yes, I mean, this paragraph is pretty important because it really spells out the number of reviews, the number of visits, the number of inspections for any portion of the work, and number of inspections for any portion of the work to determine final completion. So previously we saw that you do an inspection at the substantial completion and at final completion, but anything beyond that, depending on how it's specified in this paragraph, it's going to be an additional service. Okay, 4.2.4. Except for services required under section 3.6.6.5 and those services that do not exceed the limits set forth in section 4.2.3, construction phase services provided more than 60 days after 1. The date of substantial completion of the work, or 2. The initial date of substantial completion identified in the agreement between the owner and contractor, whichever is earlier, shall be compensated as additional services to the extent the architect incurs additional cost in providing those construction phase services. I think this is also a pretty important paragraph to keep in mind. Essentially, it says that, I mean, before I say that, remember how previously we said that your construction phase services end by issuing the certificate of the final certificate of payment? But we are seeing here that if you have to work for more than 60 days after either substantial completion, the way it is done in the work, or substantial completion as it is identified in the agreements, whichever one is earlier, you get to pay for that. Which makes sense because you can't work forever on these construction fees. And then the last paragraph in this article, 4.2.5, if the services covered by this agreement have not been completed within the months of the date of this agreement, through no fault of the architect, extension on the architect services beyond that time shall be compensated as additional services. Kind of similar to the paragraph before and sort of self-explanatory. So to sort of summarize it, this, as we did previously, this Article 4 is pretty specific about these supplemental and additional services. It is really important to understand the difference between the two and the mechanisms that create supplement and define supplemental and additional services. So yeah, I think that's it for this article. Next, we're going to be looking at owner's responsibilities.